Have you ever stopped to think about the origins of morality, the very principles that guide the lives of millions across generations? Today, we'll transport ourselves back over 3,000 years to a pivotal moment in human history, a moment at the foot of Mount Sinai, where thunder and lightning announced the presence of God, and the 10 Commandments were etched into stone. This is more than the story of Moses. It's the story of humanity's first covenant with the divine, a test of trust, and the birth of a people chosen to carry God's light. Buckle up, this journey will leave you inspired and in awe. 3 months after their miraculous escape from slavery in Egypt, the Israelites found themselves at the foot of Mount Sinai, a majestic peak rising sharply from the desolate desert. This was no ordinary mountain, and their arrival here was no coincidence. It was the place chosen by God to deliver a set of laws that would forever transform not just the Israelites, but human civilization itself. Camped at the base of the mountain, the Israelites had no way of knowing the magnitude of what was about to unfold. They were a weary but hopeful community, searching for guidance and clarity in their newfound freedom. For centuries, they had lived under the oppressive rule of the Egyptians, their lives dictated by Pharaoh's whims. Now, they stood on the cusp of forging their own identity as a nation under God. At the center of this moment was Moses, their divinely appointed leader. Imagine a modern-day figure of great authority, someone like Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, leading a nation through times of profound transformation. Moses was their mediator, their voice to God, and their guiding force. Feeling an undeniable call, Moses prepared to ascend the mountain, knowing that this was no ordinary meeting. He was about to encounter the Almighty, who would provide the moral and spiritual framework for this emerging nation. When Moses reached the summit, a cloud enveloped the mountain, and the voice of God echoed with a power that could shake the soul. God declared, "If you obey my covenant and keep my commands, you will be my treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Moses, overwhelmed with awe, received the divine instructions. He returned to the people with this profound message, and the Israelites, inspired by their leader, collectively agreed, "We will do everything the Lord has said." This moment is akin to a constitutional convention in modern terms. Imagine a gathering where the foundational principles of a nation are laid down. Just as figures like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison drafted the U.S. Constitution, Moses stood as the intermediary for the laws that would define the Israelites' covenant with God. But this was more than a legal document. It was a spiritual agreement that would set them apart as a chosen people. God instructed the Israelites to prepare for his descent. They were to consecrate themselves over 3 days, abstain from distractions, and focus entirely on the holiness of what was about to occur. On the 3rd day, the heavens seemed to open. Thunder roared, lightning flashed, and a thick cloud descended upon Mount Sinai. The mountain itself trembled violently, as if the earth recognized the presence of its creator. A trumpet blast grew louder and louder, summoning the Israelites to witness this unprecedented event. At this moment, God spoke directly to the people, delivering the 10 Commandments. These laws, simple yet profound, laid the foundation for moral behavior. 1. You shall have no other gods before me. 2. You shall not make for yourself an idol. 3. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. 4. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 5. Honor your father and your mother. 6. You shall not murder. 7. You shall not commit adultery. 8. You shall not steal. 9. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. 10. You shall not covet. The significance of these commandments cannot be overstated. They were not just a list of rules, but a moral framework that emphasized respect for God, family, and community. Compare this moment to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948 to promote peace and equality among nations. The 10 Commandments were, in essence, an ancient version of this, a universal guide for how to live in harmony with others and with God. Despite the grandeur of this revelation, the Israelites' human frailty soon became evident. While Moses was on the mountain receiving further instructions, the people below grew impatient. Days turned into weeks, and doubt began to creep into their hearts. They questioned whether Moses would return and, more importantly, whether God was still with them. In their fear and restlessness, they turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, and demanded a tangible God to worship. Aaron, succumbing to their pressure, melted their gold and fashioned a calf, a symbol of strength and fertility. The people danced and celebrated before the idol, declaring, "This is your God, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." This act of betrayal was not unlike the loss of trust experienced during times of political or societal instability. Think of moments when leaders faltered under pressure or nations turned to quick fixes instead of enduring solutions. The Israelites' creation of the golden calf was a lapse of faith, a short-sighted attempt to fill the void of uncertainty. On the mountaintop, God saw what was happening and was furious. He warned Moses of the people's rebellion, threatening to destroy them. Moses, however, interceded on their behalf, pleading for God's mercy. When Moses descended and saw the idolatry with his own eyes, his anger was palpable. He smashed the stone tablets, symbols of the covenant, and confronted the people for their sin. This moment of failure was met with both justice and forgiveness. The idol was destroyed, the people were punished, but God's mercy prevailed. Moses returned to Mount Sinai to plead for a second chance, spending 40 days and 40 nights in fasting and prayer. God, in his infinite grace, renewed the covenant and rewrote the 10 Commandments on new stone tablets. When Moses descended this time, his face radiated with divine light, a visible sign of his communion with God. This glowing visage was a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the enduring nature of God's covenant. The story of the Israelites at Mount Sinai is a timeless lesson in faith, obedience, and redemption. Like great leaders of our modern era, Moses guided his people through moments of triumph and failure. The 10 Commandments, much like the principles upheld by figures such as Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King Jr., stand as enduring symbols of justice, morality, and hope. This narrative reminds us that even in moments of doubt and disobedience, there is always a path back to grace, if we are willing to seek it. When Moses reached the summit of Mount Sinai, a dense cloud descended upon the mountain, wrapping it in divine mystery. From within the cloud, a majestic voice echoed, breaking the stillness. "Moses, speak to the Israelites. Tell them, if they obey my commands and keep my covenant, they will become my treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This was no ordinary conversation. It was the establishment of a sacred covenant, a divine agreement that would define the Israelites as God's chosen people. Moses, standing in the presence of the Almighty, was overwhelmed with reverence and gratitude. The weight of this moment was not lost on him. It was as though he had been handed the constitution of a nation yet to be fully formed, a moral compass for a people destined to impact the world. Returning to the camp, Moses gathered the elders and relayed the Lord's message. Their response was unanimous and resolute. "We will do all that the Lord says." This collective commitment can be likened to pivotal moments in history when leaders inspired their people to unite under a common cause. Think of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which rallied a divided nation around the ideals of liberty and equality. Similarly, Moses' role was to unify the Israelites under a higher purpose, one rooted in faith and obedience. God then gave Moses specific instructions to prepare the people for what was about to happen, a divine encounter unlike any other. "Tell the people to consecrate themselves for 2 days," God commanded. "They must wash their clothes and purify their hearts. On the 3rd day, I will descend upon Mount Sinai in their sight. But warn them, no one is to touch the mountain, or they will surely die." This preparation process was both physical and spiritual, underscoring the holiness of what was about to occur. It wasn't simply about cleanliness. It was about readiness, about recognizing the weight of standing before a perfect and holy God. This moment could be compared to the discipline and preparation required for an audience with modern figures of great power, like meeting a world leader or the Pope. The Israelites were being reminded that this encounter was sacred, requiring reverence, humility, and a focus on their covenant with God. On the 3rd day, the atmosphere was electrifying. Thunder roared and lightning flashed across the sky as a thick cloud descended upon Mount Sinai. The earth trembled violently, and a piercing trumpet blast filled the air, growing louder and louder. This was not a subtle display. It was an awe-inspiring spectacle meant to demonstrate the power and majesty of God. The people were terrified, and rightly so. They stood at the foot of the mountain, witnessing a divine revelation that no one could ignore. Moses alone approached the summit, where the Lord descended in fire, shrouding the mountain in smoke that billowed like a furnace. It was a scene of raw, unparalleled majesty, a stark reminder of the chasm between humanity's frailty and God's holiness. Here, God delivered the 10 Commandments to Moses, beginning with the declaration, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." This introduction was not just a statement of identity. It was a reminder of the relationship between God and the Israelites, a bond forged through deliverance and grace. The commandments that followed were straightforward yet profound, addressing humanity's relationship with God and with one another. 1. Worship no other gods. 2. Do not create idols. 3. Honor the name of the Lord. 4. Keep the Sabbath holy. 5. Respect your parents. 6. Do not murder. 7. Do not commit adultery. 8. Do not steal. 9. Do not bear false witness. 10. Do not covet. These laws laid the foundation for moral living, emphasizing justice, respect, and accountability. They were not merely religious mandates. They were a framework for building a just society. Compare this to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which serves as a modern guide for how nations should treat their citizens. Just as the Declaration champions the inherent dignity of every person, the 10 Commandments established a vision of how humans should relate to God and to one another. As Moses descended with these laws, the Israelites faced the daunting task of living up to their commitment. The covenant was not just about following rules. It was about relationship. It required trust, discipline, and a willingness to prioritize God's will above their own. This sacred covenant was a turning point, one that elevated the Israelites from a wandering group of ex-slaves to a nation with a divine purpose. Much like leaders who inspire transformation in their people, think of Nelson Mandela leading South Africa out of apartheid. Moses' role was to guide the Israelites into a new identity. The covenant at Mount Sinai was not just a set of laws. It was a calling, a declaration that the Israelites were chosen to reflect God's holiness to the world. The dialogue between God and Moses at Mount Sinai is a timeless reminder of the power of commitment and the responsibility that comes with it. It speaks to the profound relationship between humanity and the divine, a relationship that calls for faith, obedience, and an unwavering trust in the promises of God. On the morning of the third day, an extraordinary and awe-inspiring event unfolded on Mount Sinai. Thunder echoed across the desert, lightning illuminated the darkened sky, and smoke billowed from the mountain as if it were a colossal furnace. The earth trembled violently, and the piercing sound of a trumpet grew louder with each moment. The Israelites, gathered at the foot of the mountain, were overcome with fear and awe, recognizing that they were in the presence of a power far greater than anything they had ever known. Moses, acting as the intermediary between God and his people, led them out of the camp to witness this divine spectacle. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of sacred anticipation, as if the entire universe had paused to bear witness to this moment. The scene was overwhelming, not unlike the feeling of standing before a monumental figure in history, such as Martin Luther King Jr. delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech, or watching Winston Churchill inspire a nation during World War II. This was a moment that would define not just a generation, but all of human history. Amidst the thunder and smoke, the voice of God resonated, commanding the attention of every living soul. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." This opening statement was more than just an introduction. It was a declaration of divine authority and a reminder of the relationship between God and the Israelites. God was not a distant or abstract deity. He was their deliverer, the one who had freed them from oppression. This context gave weight to the laws that followed, emphasizing that these commandments were not arbitrary rules but a covenant rooted in love and liberation. The 10 Commandments were then proclaimed, each one carrying profound significance. "You shall have no other gods before me." This command emphasized the exclusivity of worship and loyalty to God, establishing the foundation of monotheism. In today's terms, it's like a leader demanding undivided allegiance for the sake of unity and purpose, similar to how George Washington stressed national unity in the early days of America. You shall not make for yourself an image or idol. This command rejected the common practices of idol worship prevalent in ancient cultures. It was a revolutionary idea that pointed to a God beyond physical representation, one who could not be confined to human constructs. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. This law underscored the sanctity of God's name, reminding people to approach him with reverence and respect. In modern times, this could be likened to honoring the dignity of a nation's leader or preserving the integrity of an institution's reputation. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. The Sabbath was set apart as a day of rest and worship, radical concept in a world that valued endless labor. This command continues to resonate today, reminding us of the importance of rest and reflection in a fast-paced world. Honor your father and mother. This command established the importance of family and respect for authority. It's akin to the principles taught by renowned leaders like Nelson Mandela, who emphasized reconciliation and respect for the elders who shaped a community. You shall not murder. This law affirmed the sanctity of human life, a principle that forms the backbone of justice systems around the world. You shall not commit adultery. By safeguarding the sanctity of marriage, this command reinforced the value of trust and fidelity in relationships, which are cornerstones of a stable society. You shall not steal. This command underscored the importance of respect for others' property, forming the basis for ethical commerce and social trust. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Truthfulness and integrity were highlighted as essential for justice and harmonious living, much like the ideals championed by modern legal systems. You shall not covet. By addressing internal desires, this command went beyond external actions to confront the root of many societal issues: greed and envy. It's a lesson that resonates even in the corporate world, where unchecked ambition can lead to ethical lapses. These commandments were not merely a set of rules. They were a moral framework designed to guide human behavior and cultivate a society rooted in justice, compassion, and accountability. The Ten Commandments transcended the immediate context of the Israelites and became a foundation for ethical principles embraced by cultures around the world. Consider their lasting impact. Just as the U.S. Constitution shaped the governance of a nation, the Ten Commandments laid the groundwork for the moral and legal codes of countless civilizations. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Mother Teresa lived by principles that echo these commandments, advocating for truth, nonviolence, and service to others. The delivery of these laws also highlighted the nature of God's relationship with humanity. While the commandments were demanding, they were not oppressive. They reflected a God who sought to elevate his people, calling them to a higher standard of living that would set them apart as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The reaction of the Israelites to the awe-inspiring presence of the Lord was one of overwhelming fear and reverence. As they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, witnessing the thundering skies, flashes of lightning, the thick smoke rising like a furnace, and the trembling earth, they were struck with sheer terror. The voice of God, majestic and commanding, resonated through the air, filling their hearts with both awe and dread. It was a moment of unparalleled spiritual intensity, one that exposed the fragility of human beings in the presence of divine holiness. Their fear was not irrational. Imagine standing in front of a global figure whose very presence commands respect and awe. Someone like Nelson Mandela addressing the United Nations, or Martin Luther King Jr. delivering his iconic speech on civil rights. Even in these modern contexts, the power of such figures to move people emotionally is undeniable. Now magnify that sensation to an infinite degree, where the very essence of existence seems to shake under the weight of the divine presence. This was what the Israelites experienced. As the divine majesty unfolded before their eyes, the Israelites were too afraid to draw near to the mountain. They turned to Moses, their trusted leader and mediator, and pleaded, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Their fear was deeply rooted in their recognition of their own unworthiness and the sheer magnitude of the Lord's power. To them, hearing the voice of God directly was not only terrifying, It felt like a death sentence. This reaction illustrates a timeless human response to the unknown and the overwhelming. Just as individuals might feel intimidated in the presence of influential leaders or historical events, the Israelites felt the weight of their inadequacy. Consider the fear felt by diplomats negotiating with towering figures like Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War II or John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. These leaders carried immense authority, and even their allies approached them with a mix of reverence and cautious respect. Similarly, the Israelites could not bear the thought of standing in direct proximity to the ultimate authority, God Himself. Moses, however, demonstrated the courage and faith of a true leader. He reassured the Israelites, saying, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of Him will keep you from sinning." This statement was both profound and comforting. Moses explained that God's display of power was not meant to harm them, but to instill a sense of holy fear, a reverence that would guide them to live righteously. In many ways, Moses' role here mirrors that of a trusted advisor or mediator in modern contexts. Think of figures like Mahatma Gandhi, who reassured people during times of great turmoil and led them toward peaceful resistance. Or consider the leadership of someone like Angela Merkel, who calmly guided Europe through economic crises with a steady hand and clear vision. Moses, too, served as a stabilizing force, bridging the gap between the divine and the human. His words reminded the Israelites that fear, when rooted in respect and understanding, could be transformative rather than paralyzing. Despite Moses' reassurance, the Israelites' fear did not dissipate entirely. The enormity of what they had witnessed was too great for their minds to fully comprehend. They stood at a distance, hesitant and trembling, while Moses once again approached the thick darkness where God was present. Their reluctance to come closer underscores a universal human tendency. When confronted with something far beyond our understanding, we instinctively retreat. This dynamic of fear and retreat can be seen throughout history in moments when humanity encounters the extraordinary. For example, when scientists first unveiled the immense power of nuclear energy, the world stood in awe and fear. Leaders like Harry Truman and Albert Einstein grappled with the ethical and moral implications of such power, just as the Israelites struggled to reconcile their fear of God with the realization of His goodness and authority. The Israelites' fear was also a reflection of their understanding of sin and holiness. They knew that God's holiness was absolute, and that their own imperfection made them unworthy to stand in His presence. This awareness of human fallibility is echoed in countless narratives, both historical and modern. Consider figures like Abraham Lincoln, who, during the Civil War, spoke often of his reliance on divine guidance, fully aware of his own limitations. The Israelites, like Lincoln, were deeply conscious of the gap between human frailty and divine perfection. Their fear also reveals an important aspect of human psychology, the need for mediation. The Israelites trusted Moses to act as their intermediary because they recognized their inability to approach God directly. This dependence on a mediator is a recurring theme in both religious and secular contexts. Just as the Israelites turned to Moses, nations often rely on diplomats to mediate during conflicts, and individuals turn to counselors or spiritual leaders for guidance in times of crisis. Moses' willingness to approach God on behalf of the people highlights his unique role as a leader chosen by God. Unlike the Israelites, Moses did not shrink back in fear. He stepped forward with courage, fully aware of the gravity of his task. This act of bravery is reminiscent of leaders who face daunting challenges head-on. Whether it's Churchill during the Blitz or Malala Yousafzai advocating for education in the face of danger, Moses' actions remind us that true leadership often requires stepping into the unknown, even when others are too afraid to follow. Ultimately, the Israelites' fear at Mount Sinai was not without purpose. It served as a reminder of God's power and holiness, instilling in them a reverence that would shape their identity as His chosen people. Their reaction also highlights a universal truth. Fear, when paired with faith, can lead to growth and transformation. While the Israelites stood at a distance, afraid to approach, Moses exemplified what it means to trust in God's presence and purpose. This moment at Mount Sinai remains a profound illustration of the tension between human frailty and divine majesty. It challenges us to confront our fears, to seek guidance through trusted mediators, and to recognize that reverence for the divine can lead us to greater moral and spiritual heights. Like the Israelites, we too may stand trembling before the unknown, but with faith and the guidance of wise leaders, we can move forward into the purposes set before us. The incident of the golden calf stands as one of the most dramatic and heart-wrenching moments in the narrative of the Israelites, a stark lesson in the perils of impatience and misplaced trust. While Moses was communing with God on Mount Sinai, receiving the sacred laws that would guide this fledgling nation, the people below succumbed to fear and uncertainty. Their faith, tested in the absence of their leader, wavered, leading them down a path of rebellion. The Israelites approached Aaron, Moses' brother and second in command, with a desperate demand. "We don't know what has happened to Moses. Make us a god to go before us." Their words reflected both their impatience and their deep-seated need for something tangible to hold on to. This is a scenario we often see throughout history, moments when people, faced with uncertainty, turn to visible symbols or figures to anchor their hope. For example, during periods of political unrest or economic instability, nations have sometimes placed blind trust in charismatic but flawed leaders, seeking reassurance in their authority. Aaron, despite his role as a spiritual leader, faltered under the pressure. Reluctantly, he instructed the people to gather their gold, earrings, jewelry, and ornaments, and from these precious items, he crafted a golden calf. The calf, a symbol of strength and fertility in the ancient Near East, became an object of worship. The people, filled with misguided enthusiasm, proclaimed, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." They celebrated with a festival, feasting and indulging in revelry, oblivious to the gravity of their betrayal. This moment of collective failure can be likened to instances in modern history when societies, gripped by fear or impatience, have turned away from foundational principles. Consider the stock market crash of 1929, when panic led to rash decisions, or the political instability of post-World War I Europe, where desperation gave rise to authoritarian regimes. In these moments, just as with the Israelites, the inability to trust in unseen outcomes or to exercise patience resulted in disastrous consequences. Meanwhile, at the summit of Mount Sinai, Moses was unaware of the chaos unfolding below. Engaged in a divine encounter, he was receiving the 10 Commandments, etched by the finger of God onto 2 stone tablets. But the Lord, in his omniscience, saw what was happening and spoke to Moses with righteous anger. "Go down immediately, for your people, whom you brought out of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned away from what I commanded them and made a golden idol." The Lord's words carried both disappointment and a test for Moses, whose leadership would now be put to its ultimate challenge. Moses descended the mountain, the 2 stone tablets in his hands, only to be confronted with a scene of utter betrayal. The people, whom he had led out of slavery with the promise of a covenant with God, were dancing and worshiping the golden calf. The contrast between the holiness of the divine laws in his hands and the chaos of idolatry before him was stark and heartbreaking. In a moment of profound anger and despair, Moses hurled the stone tablets to the ground, shattering them, a symbolic act that reflected the breaking of the covenant between God and his people. Moses then confronted Aaron, his trusted brother, demanding an explanation. Aaron's response was weak and defensive, revealing the human tendency to deflect blame in moments of failure. "You know how prone these people are to evil," he said. "They gave me their gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Aaron's excuse, though absurd, mirrored the way leaders throughout history have sometimes struggled to take accountability in moments of crisis. Think of high-profile scandals where leaders blamed circumstances or others rather than owning their mistakes. Aaron's failure as a leader in this moment is a reminder of the weight of responsibility that comes with positions of authority. Moses' response was swift and decisive. He destroyed the golden calf, burning it and grinding it into powder. He scattered the remains in water and forced the Israelites to drink it, a symbolic act meant to impress upon them the bitterness of their sin. This act can be likened to leaders throughout history who have dismantled harmful ideologies or systems, ensuring their influence would not persist. For instance, post-World War II efforts to denazify Germany aimed to erase the symbols and structures that had led to destruction. But Moses' role as a leader did not end with punishment. He understood that the people's sin required not only correction but also intercession. With a heavy heart, Moses turned back to God and pleaded for forgiveness on behalf of the Israelites. His prayer was both humble and bold. "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed! They have made themselves a god of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. If not, then blot me out of the book you have written." This willingness to sacrifice himself for the sake of his people on the selflessness that defines true leadership. This moment of intercession calls to mind figures like Abraham Lincoln, who bore the weight of a divided nation during the Civil War and worked tirelessly to heal its wounds. Similarly, leaders like Nelson Mandela, who sought reconciliation after the end of apartheid, exemplified the kind of courage and humility Moses displayed. Moses' appeal to God was not just an act of mediation. It was a demonstration of his unwavering commitment to his people despite their failures. God's response was both just and merciful. He declared that those who sinned against him would face consequences, but he also reaffirmed his covenant with the Israelites. This balance of justice and mercy reflects the divine character and serves as a lesson in leadership. Just as Moses advocated for his people, leaders today are often called to balance accountability with compassion, ensuring that justice is served while also offering a path toward restoration. The golden calf incident is a timeless story, rich with lessons about faith, patience, and the dangers of turning away from foundational principles in moments of uncertainty. It reminds us that even in our failures, there is room for forgiveness and redemption. Just as Moses stood as an intercessor for his people, leaders and individuals alike are called to step into the gap, guiding others back to the path of trust and integrity. The story of Moses and the Ten Commandments is more than ancient history. It's a timeless reminder of God's enduring love and patience for humanity, even in our moments of failure. These commandments remain a beacon of guidance, inviting us to live with purpose, compassion, and faith. Let this extraordinary encounter inspire you to deepen your connection with God and embrace the principles that lead to a meaningful life. Thank you for journeying with us. Until next time, keep walking in faith and hope.